Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 15 of our study, which covers the Book of Genesis, chapters 25 and 26. In this lesson, we will move on and explore Isaac's relationship with God, such as it is, and what comes his way following the death of his father. There is this thing that is very relevant in the story of especially Isaac's two sons, but also in the context of all of the patriarchs, that is this idea of God's blessing being a thing that passes from father to son, to question mark, we'll get there, sons, that is very relevant and quite interesting. It seems to be inherently tied with God's favor and with the covenant. So Isaac starts to talk with God, especially and kind of only about the covenant, at the same time that this blessing kind of kicks in and the things that he's doing begin to prosper excessively, kind of regardless of his effort, as we saw also happen with Abraham. At this point in the history of these people, that is how God's favor is shown, right? Like, God is with you. He has promised things in the future, so the things you're doing are going to prosper materially. That is not a thing that we should take away and say, if I find favor with God, that means I'm going to be blessed and all of my endeavors are going to prosper materially. From a context point of view, right? This is a very small number of people with a very large destiny. And that sort of thing requires some amount of wealth to get to. So the people in line with the covenant are receiving wealth, but the wealth is in service of the covenant. It is a necessary byproduct of, I promised you guys all of this stuff, and it just so happens that it seems like you need to be rich to see that through. So it is not that God wants to make them wealthy because he favors them. It's that at this stage in the development of the covenant, they need to be wealthy to further and to progress the covenant. Just like at some times later, they need to be very successful in war to further the covenant. And so you have David blessed by God who can't seem to lose a battle. It is not that God's blessing is you're going to be able to excessively murder all of your enemies all the time. That's not necessarily God's thing. It's that for the stability that's required in service of the covenant right now, that means you have to be successful in this regard above and beyond normal. And so at different times, the fulfillment of these promises manifests in different things that are outside of the ordinary for different people. But we shouldn't take those things as the exceptional things, right? They work in service of the covenant, as do, for example, prophets are another category like that, right? It's just, you wouldn't look at the prophets and say, yes, sign me up necessarily. Whereas some of these other things you would. But it's all throughout the history we see of these people, we see manifestations of extraordinary things at different points in time for different individuals that do look like God's favor and are God's favor. But the thing to keep in mind isn't that favor is so important. the thing to keep in mind is that it's in service of this covenant that marches toward Jesus Christ and the salvation of all souls, or the potential for salvation of all souls. So God isn't making, it's not an end in and of itself that God is making first Abraham and then Isaac and later Jacob very wealthy. It is a means to an end, and that end is the fulfillment of the covenant. So that is why when Abraham passes, Isaac both begins to prosper and begins to have God appear to him and say, so about that covenant, you're it whether you like me or not. And so here we are. And I think probably the incredible prosperity that comes with it likely warms Isaac to the idea of God a little bit. Especially when it's clear that like there was a shift, right? Like he was kind of ordinary in outcomes of things, and then Abraham died, and then he was extraordinary. And then God started talking to him. And maybe in the back of his mind he thought, well, now I can kind of see what Dad was talking about, right? Like, still sure that there's this divide, right? Like, he doesn't seem to have still super warm conversations with God, right? And they keep it it's a very transactional and business kind of relationship. But at least in that regard, Isaac seems willing to go along enough that in one instance here, God is even able to tell him where to settle and where not to go, and he listens. That structure is really important, right? Of what is that blessing and how does it work? So for right now, we have the patriarchs, we have one guy, right? Abraham had the one son, Isaac, that is the clear one who's going to inherit this. What happens when we start to have more than one son? First 2 and then 12. And then, like, this is part of the promise, right? Descendants as countless as the stars. You can't do that one at a time. And right now you have the structure of this blessing going one at a time. It's going to have to be able to, at some point, branch out and expand, and that will require a shift. The question is, when does that happen and how does it work? So Isaac and Rebekah have 2 sons, and we see here the beginning of tension there. We see that they are from birth at odds. And God speaks to which parent? To Rebekah, and says, they're going to be at odds, and this is the one that I like. Again, very transactional, bare minimum, blessing and covenant related dialogue between Isaac and God, right? It's go here, prosper, remember I'm going to do all these things for you, listen to me this one time, please. Whereas with Rebekah, it's, you've got these 2 children, and, your husband is going to like this one, and but don't be fooled, like this younger one, this is my guy. And it's on Rebekah to see to God's will between her 2 children. Interesting dynamics. When Hagar when Sarah, and by means of that Hagar, took into their own hands trying to direct God's will, they did an oopsie, right? Like that was not, in that dynamic, Abraham was clearly the one in better tune with God's will, right? And Sarah was along for the ride. In this case, Isaac is the one who has the blessing, so he can't be cut out. But the one who's really along for the ride of God's will and interested in helping enforce and establish that is Rebekah still. So interesting situation for sure. And we set up some of the pieces of what's going to come when Jacob and Esau grow up a little bit. And we have just the whole family is relevant and involved in what comes next. It also creates a situation where in a normal family, the birthright or the inheritance would be that really matters, right? Like who gets mom and dad's stuff when they're gone and how much of it, like that kind of thing tears families apart. And we see here Isaac or Esau looking a bit indifferent to his inheritance, the material inheritance. Why is that? At this point, Isaac being the second generation with this blessing, and Esau being the oldest son, which is more important? The favor of God that makes everything you do rain money from the sky, practically, or a little bit of that money. The blessing is the thing that matters, right? So Esau can be very cavalier about what portion of Isaac's stuff he gets because he's assuming that he's going to get this blessing. He's in line and dad likes him better. So he doesn't need to worry about his birthright in terms of inheritance of property because he has uniquely, he thinks, among all humanity, this other thing that is coming to him that is vastly more valuable, which is we're still at the point where we're saying only one son can inherit this blessing. So I think that adds a little color to what seems a little odd from Esau's point of view. But we're setting up that of the things that matter, the inheritance isn't it. And this blessing and the prosperity that comes with it is it. And it's a big deal. And that's going to become a point of contention between everybody. It divides the family. And interesting things happen not in this lesson. The other thing we see here is a further repetition of a story that we've already seen with Abraham and Sarah twice. Once in Egypt and once with the Philistines. And now we see it here with Isaac and Rebekah and with the Philistines as well. We will talk about it a little bit. We're not going to go into great detail because it's kind of been there, done that. But it does lead to establishing what is the character of or the nature of Isaac's relationship with the Philistines versus Abraham's. And what does that mean for the people in the land? That part of it is important. We also have some further genealogies that tend to serve the same purpose that they have been all along the way, right? We go down a genealogy when we're no longer going to deal with the branch of the tree, right? So we wrap up, for example, any other kids Abraham had after he's dead and he's not in the story anymore, right? It's that branch done. We'll just mention that there's this other limb here, but it doesn't matter because now we're narrowing in on this nice Isaac looking limb and everything else out of the way doesn't matter. And we'll do a little bit of that, but it is the same as it has been. It is when you get to those things, it is not because they matter. It's because they don't anymore. And so that'll be that, and we'll kind of plow through those as well. As noted in the intro, this is kind of wrapping up Abraham's story, right? We've gotten to Sarah dead. Now we're getting to what Abraham does after that and Abraham passing along, which is Abraham does take another wife, but she's not considered, from the God point of view, it's kind of treated like he had one wife. And so he does have another companion and other children and another family that he sends away and with gifts, but that don't have share in the main inheritance, right? Like here in Abraham's case, the birthright, the inheritance, and that blessing are joined things, right? It's not conceptually separate, right? Things keep kind of separating to show what's God and what's not, right? Here it's all together to Isaac and to only Isaac, other than some gifts that are given. That doesn't remain true of Isaac's sons. And that's where things start to get fascinating. But for now, that happens. Abraham dies. We list some of those other children because, again, that's what we do when we acknowledge that they exist and they aren't relevant anymore. Abraham is buried in the cave on the field that he bought where Sarah was buried. We talked about that in the last lesson. It's really interesting, but it is noted that Abraham is buried there, and now he has, in ripe old age, passed along. Speaking of kind of trimming these branches out for the sake of our narrative story, we also have Abraham's other line that's not Isaac, that is Ishmael. So now we do the same thing, right? We list who are those descendants, what happens, and in doing so, we're saying, yep, we're done with that too. And let's just put that off to the side as well. And that's why that's here, is we're creating separation and distance between the sons of Abraham that are not Isaac. Now we get to the relevant part of the genealogy, which you can identify again because it's not just so-and-so became the father of so-and-so and this other guy and another one, and then this one became the father of those ones and that one became, right? When you stop and you have more than that, then it's important. And when it really stops and digs into more than just an extra sentence or two and starts to get into narrative, then that's the really important part, right? So it fits in, it's like this whole structure of a lot of this is a genealogy with brief interruptions for some narrative around the things that are important, which is kind of interesting structurally, but I think it can be useful to see that that's sort of structurally how this is happening and progressing. So now we're at another pause point in our genealogy where we have Isaac and Rebekah, who eventually become the parents of, well, we'll get to it, Esau and Jacob. But first, they have the same problem that Abraham and Sarah had, which is that Rebekah is barren. And we know the thing that changed it is Isaac prayed to God. He had a very helpful and personally relevant history with that, having been the result of Abraham's prayers to God and conversations with God about his own mother's being barren. So this is an interesting one because Isaac prays, but he had a problem that human means cannot solve, right? That was incredibly relevant to both him and his wife that he loves, right? This seems like a case where they probably tried most other things first, and then ultimately, like, he's not left. He's in a kind of a what do you have to lose situation here, where, well, it works for dad, right? I guess, what have I got to lose, right? And God fittingly kicks in and shows, I'll show you how praying to me and how this blessing thing works. You want one child? Have two. That's how it's going to be from now on. You want this? I will give you that, and so much more. And so here we go. Prayer answered. And it reads like it happens quickly, right? We don't know, but it would have taken them a while to figure out they were barren. Their time has passed. But it's a long, drawn out source of angst for Abraham, right? And the solutions that they seek to take along the way, it's a long, drawn out situation and problem for Abraham. They try various solutions along the way that are not just relying on God, including, here's my maid, that'll count. And like, they, despite Abraham's faith and his dedication to God, they still, as a couple, end up, experimenting with other possible solutions as well. Here, that's not what happens. They ask and rely on God, and they don't try some of these other things. And I think the difference there is not the difference between Abraham and Isaac, but the difference between Sarah and Rebekah. And I suspect in the background there was probably some prodding by Rebekah of Isaac to inquire of God. But they're focused on just the solution of asking God and letting him deal with the problem, which he does. And then we see a fascinating thing happen. When there are the two children and Rebekah's struggling in pregnancy, God speaks to her. And she and God have a conversation. Isaac's, we just see, Isaac prayed to God and the problem was solved. But the conversation with God, the meaningful conversation about this and the future of the line and what's the deal with these kids, is between Rebekah and God, further reinforcing that kind of a very key part of how that relationship with God is passing along is Rebekah, more so even than Isaac. I know I've made that point before, but it's fascinating to think about because Isaac gets all the credit, usually. We also see two sons. The younger of these two sons is going to be the bigger deal, and the elder is going to serve the younger, and they're going to be divided and against each other. But eventually, elder will serve younger. We don't really know if Rebekah conveyed that information to her husband, or if, like our Lord's mother, she kept that in her heart and pondered it. But it's important to know past this lesson when we get to some of what unfolds, that Rebekah had this conversation with God and has this expectation about her children. Then after, eventually and at long last, and after a difficult pregnancy, the two children are born. Esau comes first. He looks red, and Jacob comes out, as it says, grabbing onto his heel as he's born. Like, it becomes very symbolic, like trying to get ahead of him and grab at his place. That becomes a strong characterization of the two sons. We also see, we do get a marker of time here at the end, in that Isaac is 60 years old when this happens, and he was around 40 when he was married. So it did take them quite some time for this to happen, and they didn't try other solutions. And it took Isaac 20 years to be desperate enough to talk to God. So that really says, that kind of says it all. But he does, and he has two sons, and we know they're going to be a bit at odds. Then we get our first anecdote of the two brothers when they're grown. We hear that Esau likes hunting, while Jacob is more of a homebody, and that there's this odd story where Esau's been out hunting, he's hungry, he comes by Jacob, who's cooking, and he says, "Give me something to eat." And Jacob says, "First sell me your birthright, and then I'll give you something to eat." And Esau despises his birthright. He says, "Well, I don't care about that. What use is it to me if I'm dying anyway?" Presumably of hunger, although he probably wasn't that hungry. And sure thing, where do I sign? Like, give me something to eat, right? Which is an odd thing, but we unpacked it a little bit in the introduction as well. I think the reasoning here that makes sense is twofold. Either Esau doesn't care about stuff at all, which we will see is not true later when the other thing happens. If you know, you know. Like, eventually there's a similar but different thing to this that Esau gets genuinely very upset about, to the point that he and his brother are estranged for a long time, and Jacob is afraid that if he sees him again, he's going to try to kill him. Maybe rightly so. So there's another version of Esau not getting something that was supposed to come to him that he takes not at all lightly. So it's not that he doesn't care, I don't think, which is one version. The other version is he values the other thing very highly and thinks this one is irrelevant in the comparison, which is astute of him, actually. He seems to understand that the blessing is the thing that is valuable, and the wealth doesn't really mean anything in comparison, which, again, well spotted, Esau, correct. And it means that the family has realized the extent and the power of God's blessing, right? Whether anyone outside of this family has realized this is a thing or not, it seems like they understand it's not just Abraham and his relationship with God. And even Isaac must be recognizing that for his son and talking about it for his sons to see it so clearly, right? Especially his favored son is thinking, yeah, this is a big deal and I'm going to get it from dad. And like, it's such a big deal that who cares about the possessions? I can get my own easily when I get this blessing. I think that's the deal. And he doesn't care. And I think here, Jacob is willing to try to take the bigger share of the inheritance because he knows he's not getting the blessing, right? And honestly, kind of only fair, right? If Esau's going to be so blessed and be able to go out and get whatever he wants anyway, then why can't I have more of the stuff that we already have? Because I'm going to have a harder go of it thereafter. So they seem fine with that. It's kind of an interesting exchange. I think it's here, again, to show that now, conceptually, we're separating God's blessing from the stuff. They're not the same thing, and they're being recognized as not the same thing. And in the person of Abraham, they kind of seemed like the same thing, and Abraham maybe even thought they were the same thing, and was like, I've got to give all my stuff to my son Isaac so he can, continue on this blessing here. And Isaac sees how his prosperity changes after his dad dies and says, actually, I think there might be two things going on here. And I think, actually, the stuff isn't that important because God can get us more stuff. So, to his credit, as much as Isaac's relationship with God is understandably strained, I think he probably gets the credit here for recognizing that God's blessing is a lot more than some stuff and is a very big deal. So we will give him that credit, and that mindset seems to have passed to his sons. Starting point here. Now there was a famine. It was like that other one. Like this story is like that other one, but it's not that other one. It's this one. The author recognizes the similarity, right? Like it's basically copy paste, Control F, Abraham, replace Isaac, right? Like it's really close. We'll get to that. But we're acknowledging, even the author is acknowledging that up front, right? It's like that other time, but it's not that other time. It's a new time. And importantly, though, in this part, before we get to the redundancy, we get to God talking to Isaac and saying, especially, don't go to Egypt. You need to stay around here. And I'm with you in all of this because I like your dad so much. I made all these promises to Abraham because of how close he and I were. And so you need to stay here so that I can keep the promises that I made to Abraham. If you're Isaac, you already have a strained relationship with God. That probably is not your most favorite conversation, but also, again, he's doing well. And the request he had of God was answered, right? So it's maybe a tenuous relationship, but it's not absent. And we see in this case, God tells Isaac what to do, and he does it. But we also see their conversation is kind of limited to covenant-related things, right? Like, this one's a big deal. Like, Isaac, really, I need you to not go to Egypt. That's not what we're doing yet. In famines and going down to Egypt, that's a couple generations from now that we're going to do that. For now, we need to stay here so that I can fulfill the promises that I made to your dad. And Isaac listens. But very business relationship, I would say, between Isaac and God, right? The more intimate, more personal conversation about the two sons happened with Rebekah. And it doesn't have the same feel as the conversations that God had with Abraham, even about the same things. There usually seem to be there's more of a personal character to those, because it was God promising things to Abraham as a result of things Abraham had done, right? It had developed over, Abraham, go. Okay, I'll go. Abraham, do this. Sure thing, God. And then God, okay, Abraham, this is working out really well. I'm going to give you all of this. Sure, God, sounds great. And it was, it developed organically over time. It was a result of Abraham's responses to God. It felt personal when God said, Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars and give you this land for you and your people forever and make you and your descendants a blessing to all of the nations. That felt personal. Now it feels not that. Now it's, Isaac, I'm working on making your dad's descendants as numerous as the stars. I need you to do this for that, right? Like one feels very personal and one feels a lot more clinical or businessy. And it's just what it is. It's not a thing to get hung up on, but how that relationship with God between the different patriarchs looks and manifests, that does matter, right, to our story. It matters a lot to our story. So it's worth thinking about a little bit. But the relevant And interesting thing here is that Isaac does listen to God. While we have seen this play out before, it is a little different here. So Isaac and Rebekah definitely borrow from Abraham and Sarah's playbook here. Going into a strange area, it happens to be the same one Abraham and Sarah went to the second time. Say that your wife is your sister, so that they don't try to kill you and take your sister, assuming that they would do that and they have bad intentions. In Abraham's case, the first time in Egypt, it was very clear he was correct. They had bad intentions. It was the thing to do. Second time, it was less clear. And in fact, God intervenes and alerts the Philistines and lets them know, hey, this is you know what you're doing, right? And they said, no, we did not know that. Please don't punish us for a thing we didn't know. And there's that whole exchange where Abraham makes it right. And it's unclear from that they would have done harm had they known what was going on. In this case, we see further progression. You know, we know that like wombs were stopped and like there was pretty severe punishment for them in that case. Now they catch this, they just observe Isaac and Rebekah being a little too familiar out in public or in a place that is observable even if they thought it was private. And their takeaway from that is, no. Like, what were you, like, they hadn't done anything wrong. Like, they hadn't made untoward advances that we can see, but they're pissed that they might have even, right? Like, you didn't give us the information to work with here, guy. We might have done something that caused all of us problems because you weren't forthcoming. Like, what gives? How rude. Like, you're putting us all in peril here because you don't trust that this is going to go well. We see a progression of the foreigners in their relationship with the people of God, whereas God's chosen people are stuck on the same play. The people they're dealing with are evolving and developing their defense to get ahead of that particular play. So it's an interesting development. The text also notes that, or the lesson also has a bit that notes how this likely would have been assembled at the same time kind of David's legacy was being codified, which would have included some of those books with some of those stories of David. And there's famously in David's life an instance where he definitely doesn't respect the sanctity and bonds of marriage, and as a king sees somebody that he's interested in and just thinks, I'm going to commit murder to get, like, it's the thing that they feared the Egyptians were going to do or the Philistines were going to do. See somebody hot, kill the husband, take the woman. Like, the foreigners never actually did that. And the Philistines, it seems like, would not have done that. And then David, a man after God's own heart, totally does do that. And it's quite the inversion that these foreigners, especially the Philistines in David context, would never do that, and he did, right? It just highlights like huge mistake on David's part, and like power corrupts, right? This guy who's so close to God finds his way to be king and sees an easy situation to just all I have to do is say something to somebody. I don't have to kill the guy. It's just an order to somebody, and then it's out of my hands, and it's like, what did I do? But it's too easy, right? And the temptations of his power and his office are too much for him, for even David, which, anyway, this isn't a study of that, but it is an interesting comparison that is, at the time this is being assembled, likely would have been in the minds of the people writing all of this down. But at any rate, it plays out again, and we see progression of the foreigners through their relationship with God's people. This bit is about Isaac finding a place that he can dwell, and we see a few interesting things. One, he is very prosperous, which at this point should be predictable. That's the thing that happens to him wherever he goes and whatever he does. It is so much so that the Philistines are threatened by it and by him and say, we need you to go. Go in peace. We're not chasing you out with armies or anything. We're just asking nicely, would you please go? We're threatened to bite you. And he does. The other interesting thing we see is as he's looking then for a place that he can settle, he goes to some of the places his dad was. Abraham had, remember, a deal with these guys about a well that he had dug that he could use, right? There was dispute over wells, and when he made peace with them, one of the things that got worked out was that he could keep using this well that he had dug. When Abraham died, they filled all of those in, and any of the wells that he might have dug, saying, they're annulling all of the agreements with Abraham and his kin, right? It's like, we're not carrying these. That's not a permanent inheritance, right? Again, he acquired it, he paid them for it, he was gone, they took it back. Whereas the tomb and the field that it's on, that's the only then permanent piece of owned property of these people in this land, right? Everything else is temporary. So Isaac goes back to these wells that were his dad's and thinks, I have a claim to that too. And what he runs into is, no, he doesn't. They filled them in. That's annulled. He digs them again, and they say, yep, that's ours, thanks. And he does it once, he does it a second time. Only the third time, when he digs a new well, and they don't contest it, does he say, okay, here I'll settle. It reads kind of like Abraham and Lot, and Abraham saying, what area do you want, Lot? And Lot saying, that looks like the good spot. I want that. And Lot goes there, and then Abraham goes on the other spot and prospers excessively. Isaac doesn't have to worry about where he goes because he's going to do very well, and he's trying to maintain some manner of peace with the locals. But they're not super welcoming, and his right there is only by whatever they're willing to grant him, right? He has no birthright, no inheritance, no permanent ownership or possession in this land. He can be where they let him be, and he acknowledges that and acts accordingly. So Isaac eventually then settles in Beersheba, which is kind of the main place where it seems like Abraham was for a while, including after Abraham's run-in, again, repetition, after Abraham's run-in with the Philistines, the place he ultimately settled, that he and Abimelech agreed to, and all of that was in Beersheba. And, that's where they returned after the event that Isaac would be so happy to remember. And that was kind of home base for Abraham. And we know like Isaac wasn't living there for a long time. So now again, like Isaac as now the head of the household, returning home to the place he was during all of the sacrifice events, that is also a big deal, right? Like he kind of tried not to, and then like fate and circumstances brought him right back there. And there he is. And when he gets there, he has a conversation with God. Appears to him, I should say, right? He doesn't initiate it. To be clear, God shows up and says, yep, I'm Abraham's God. Don't worry, I'm with you too. And those promises I made to Abraham, to keep them, I have to, do them for you too. So I've got you. Don't worry about it. Just further emphasis. It seems like with the blessing already going well, it seems like, and the prayer and the children, it seems like there was probably already some recognition, and they'd talked about it before. But again, God's conversations with Isaac seem to all be very businessy and covenant related, and it happens again. But this time, new things happen as well. Isaac's servants dig a well, and Isaac builds an altar. So this is kind of more than symbolically. This is Isaac kind of claiming the place of his father. He takes his family to where Isaac takes his family to where Abraham's family was based, and stands in line knowingly to the promises that God made to Abraham at the place where that ill-fated sacrifice nearly occurred. And Isaac sets up an altar there to God. And while he's there, this time we do get recognition back, right? It says he calls on the name of the Lord, which is a really interesting phrase, because we don't know what that is yet, right? Like the viewers, the readers, the spectators, it's the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Our relationship with God comes through them. But theirs doesn't come through anyone. Even, it seems, Isaac, right? Here, he puts himself back in that place and in that line, and it's like he's plugging back into and reestablishes that connection with God after some time. And now it is not just Abraham's connection with God, but it is Abraham's and Isaac's connection with God. Which doesn't change the fact that it sure seems like Rebekah has a better relationship with God. But him settling in Beersheba is a very big deal for his circumstances, and various things have kind of forced him into picking up where his dad left off. This is also a repetition. Abraham also made a deal with these exact guys at this exact place. And it was more or less the same deal. But here it happens that Abimelech and his military commander and some other henchmen go out to meet Isaac, and they say, like, let's make a pact to be at peace. We've pushed you out of our land and you've settled in a place we're okay with. We're good with that. Note how we didn't harm you, and it sure seems like God is on your side, and we would rather not be at odds. So can we make a covenant, a deal, an agreement that we are going to not harm one another? And Isaac says, that sounds like a great plan. Again, he's picking up pieces of Abraham things, right? He's living there. He made the same deal with the same locals that his dad did. Isaac, who moved away from home for understandable reasons, is back and is reestablishing the things of his father now. That this is one case where that repetition is more than just a diptych, right? It's like it or not, Isaac is becoming very Abraham-ish in how he's living his life, right? You can't get away from your parents as easily as you might think you can. And the extent to which you fall back into who they were and what they were doing is strong. And in this case, with Abraham being who he was, that's a good deal for God's promises. So Isaac is getting things reestablished. Last but not least, we get this kind of parting note that Esau takes some wives that are not at all pleasing to mom and dad and that are making life difficult. So this is definitely not like an Isaac finding Rebecca kind of deal, right? And this is the concern that Abraham had was about what happens if my son takes a local and she creates problems, and Esau takes two locals and they're creating problems. So that bit of context is helpful when we go into our further comparing and contrasting of these brothers and what happens. This has been an overview of Lesson 15 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.